Welcome to you all to our afternoon lecture panel. It's looking at the topic of Pope Francis, the Green Pope, a panel conversation on Laudate Deum. So nice to see you all here in this virtual place. We're all, I think, a little bit disappointed that the snows kept us at home, but still really delighted that we could make the choice to be online and still hear the conversation that our three panelists will have, reflecting on Laudate Deum. Before we begin, though, I would like just to take a few moments to recognize that I am here on Treaty 6 land in the homeland of the Métis. I also recognize that many people in the audience might be elsewhere, and if you would like to take a moment in the chat to put your own location and your recognition of the land that you are living on, please do so at your leisure. I think it's still, for me, very important that we take the time to give this acknowledgement, particularly when we're talking today about how do we share and live and care for our common home, our planet Earth, and the peoples that live here. So in the spirit of reconciliation and goodwill, we begin in a good way. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Gertrude Rompré. I have the pleasure of serving as the Director of Mission and Ministry at St. Thomas More College. And I'm also the co-director with Dr. Chris Rinko of the Irene and Doug Schmeiser Center for Faith, Reason, Peace, and Justice. Perhaps to just give us a little bit of background on this panel today, this is a collaboration between three of the federated colleges here in Saskatchewan, Campion College, Luther College, and ourselves, St. Thomas More College. There was a conversation between our presidents a few years back, thinking that this topic is so important that we should make a commitment to annually one of the institutions would host a lecture on the topic of caring for our common home. So this is our turn to host this year, and we'd also like to thank Dr. Chris Rinko, who's included this lecture in this panel as part of his Issues in Contemporary Catholicism. So we have the benefit of his students being here today and having prepared some questions on the document and being ready to speak into the conversation. So welcome to all of the students. So before we spend too much time, I'd really like to take the time to welcome our three panelists. Each of them bring a rich background with regards to eco-justice and caring for our common home. So I'll introduce them all quickly here at the beginning, and then I will turn it over to them to do some opening remarks and conversations. So we have here also Erica Violet Lee, who is a nêhiyaw author, poet, artist, activist, and scholar. As a climate activist, she was the lone Indigenous representative on the Canadian Youth Delegation to the UN COP21 Climate Conference. She's a community consultant for the David Suzuki Foundation and a board member for the Indigenous Climate Action Group. Michael Poellet teaches philosophy at St. Thomas More College, and he is an ordained Lutheran pastor, adjunct professor at the College of Environment at the University of Washington, president of the Interchurch Uranium Committee Educational Cooperative, and a board member of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. And last but not least, Christopher Rinko teaches religion and culture at STM. He's the co-director, as I said earlier, of the Schmeiser Center for Faith, Reason, Peace, and Justice. He serves on the boards of the Faith and the Common Good and the Catherine Donnelly Foundation, and also on the advisory circle for the Mouvement Laudate Deum Movement Canada. So I am going to turn it over now to Chris, who will give us a few just framing just a bit of an ethical framework to think about this document and our conversation today, and then we will move it to each of the other two panelists, and finally us into a dialogical mode where we'll be inviting conversation and questions. So I'll just turn it over to you, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you, Chelsea. So I just wanted to lay out a couple of frameworks and situate the question a little bit. And I want to start by saying that the meaning of green in our question is significant. So for a fuller meaning of that term of green, I generally turn to the global green movement's collaboratively and cross-culturally crafted green principles. And these principles were reaffirmed in the year 2023. So these principles are ecological wisdom, social justice, participatory democracy, nonviolence, spirituality, and respect for diversity. Pope Francis lends support, even if it is uneven and imperfect support, to each of these principles in his teaching that's presented in Laudate Deum. Most significantly, these principles show that being green is not just about hugging trees or appreciating the beauty of the natural world as a backdrop that is somehow separate from concerns about people, and also thought of as separate from concerns about marginalized people in particular. By his green teachings in general, Francis has been notably strong in establishing an almost paradoxical ability, again, to borrow a slogan from Development and Peace, to put both people and the planet first. So both first at the same time. This ethical stance flows from Francis's insistence upon coupling social and ecological approaches, and he sees that coupling as taking place without contradictions. Francis's contribution in this regard is perhaps most evident in his teaching on integral ecology that builds up upon and grows, I think, the contributions of his papal predecessors. Indeed, the term integral ecology can be taken as a shorthand for commitment to those green principles that I mentioned earlier. With a little bit of background in place for the rest of my introductory time, I want to highlight some supporting evidence for that claim. This idea that integral ecology is kind of a shorthand for green principles that can be found in Laudate Deum or sourced from Laudate Deum. Therein, in that document, it is evident that the need for incarnating green principles is even more urgent than when Francis promulgated Laudato Si, which I have right here, in case we needed it, in the run-up to the launch of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Conference of the Parties meetings that both took place in 2015. So this document is about what's happened kind of in the interval and reaffirming the importance of these green principles since 2015. Indeed, since then, it seems that the hold of segmented interests and ecological degradation, including deforestation and permafrost melt, have only accelerated. We have also witnessed extreme weather events and the further marginalization of people living on the edges of individual and global societies. So part of the antidote that Francis suggests in Laudate Deum is a green solidarity that, in accord with integral ecology, affirms both, and again at the same time, that everything is connected, and secondly, that no one is saved alone. This is a green solidarity that upholds the dignity of every single person and sets the opportunities that come into being with present social, health, economic, and ecological crises, viewing these crises as chances to build up that dignity of the human person for every living person. Heather Eden, who some of you will know, has summarized this very well and says that the challenge that sort of Catholic social teaching or Francis's teaching is setting on this point is that you have to respond to these problems, and you have to respond to the problems while loving every single person. So this is a green solidarity. This solidarity erodes the whole, the theocratic or theocentric or what Francis calls technocentric conceptions of unlimited growth have on our moral imaginations. It destroys the premise that the poor are unworthy or a problem to be eliminated. Thus, this green solidarity supports the need for a credible multilateralism beyond elite and arrogant prerogatives. So all of this is language that Francis is using in the Laudate Deum. So as my last little paragraph here, as such, and this is where I'd like to close, we are left with the need for a pilgrimage of reconciliation. This is a pilgrimage of reconciliation that's meant to take place with each other and with the ecological world. It's a pilgrimage of penance and transformation. It's a pilgrimage that needs to take to heart the insight that humans have no meaning without each other, and they have no meaning without the ecological world. And notably for Catholics who are called out on this point, Francis calls out Catholics on this point, this pilgrimage of reconciliation has to employ faith-inspired energy to work to incarnate what I've called the green principles.
Thanks, Chris, for setting up the stage for us. I'll turn it over to Erica to either give feedback to Chris or to expand on the thoughts of the document, or to share with us your past experience on this topic from other sectors as well. So welcome, Erica.
Thank you, Gertrude. Thank you, Chris. And thank you, everyone, for... Oh, I should check. Is my audio working? Is this a good... I was going to say temperature. Is this a good temperature? Clearly, my mind is on the weather. I'm in inner city Saskatoon today. This is where I live. This is where I grew up. And yeah, this is where my climate activism, although I'll address that term, I guess, a little bit later on. This is where I come from. And I wanted to start actually with a little poem. And I remember right before I got into grad school, it was actually the day I got my acceptance letter to the University of Toronto. There's a poem by Mahmoud Darwish, who is a Palestinian poet, who was a Palestinian poet, and he became known as the national, I don't know if it was official, but like unofficial at least, Palestinian poet of the people. And I remember sort of stumbling across his work, I think, before I even had Palestinian friends, and just immediately resonating with it. Because of all of the multitudinous parallels to be drawn between my experience as an Indigenous or Cree nêhiyaw person in Saskatchewan and that experience of the Palestinian experience so far away in the world, in a land that I couldn't even conceive of at the time. Like I'd never traveled outside of Canada and the US and Europe at the time. And this poem, I remember the translation, and there's lots of different translations of it, because the more I learn about Arabic as a language, the more I learn it's insufficient in English to try to translate these things. And I think this is true and definitely something worth considering when we're talking about Indigenous knowledges in terms of what they can contribute or how they can lead us forward to something that looks like climate justice. The poem is called, translation, I Belong There. I come from there. I bring the skies back to its mother when it cries over its absence. I cry so that a returning cloud may know me. I learned each language suitable for the court of blood so that I may break the rules. I learned the entire language, then disassembled it, reassembled it in order to compose a single word, homeland. So obviously right now I am thinking and have been thinking a lot about, so I've got some weird sunlight on me, there we go. I've been thinking a lot about my friends and my family and my kin right now who are undergoing genocide. It's sort of been taking up my entire headspace basically since October, and even before that. Like, that was something that I making connections between the Palestinian liberation movement and the Indigenous movements here and across the world is something that I've always been passionate about as soon as I recognized those parallels. And I think, yeah, what I'm thinking about doing as a PhD project, which I've been talking to Chris about because he's been very gently pressuring me into doing my PhD for quite a while now, in the kindest way possible, is the term Indigenous and what it means, what it can mean, and its limitations. First off, I'm old enough now that I've gone through so many iterations of terms that have been used to describe who I am or the people that I come from. I remember, like, very vaguely when Indian was the term. I remember studying political studies in my undergraduate degree and having that still be like the operating language that the Canadian state uses. And then Aboriginal, and now Indigenous, which came to take on a whole new meaning for me when I went to COP21 in 2015, the United Nations Climate Conference of Parties on Climate. I can't remember what it's called. I've blocked that part out. And yeah, I was the lone representative on that Canadian Youth Delegation. So typically in the past, the Canadian Youth Delegation to the United Nations COP Conference of Parties is sort of working in league with the government, but in this particular case, we were all sort of pegged as radicals very early on. So actually, the Minister of Environment at the time was Catherine. Oh, what's her name? Catherine McKenna, and her and Trudeau flat out refused to meet with us as the only Canadian youth delegation there. Although I did have a funny meeting with, oh, I can't remember who, but I knew nobody was listening at that point. And I remember how quickly going there, how intensely we planned, how we had such like lofty goals at the time for the things we would bring up and the talking points we wanted to get through. And the second we got to this space, it was very clear that it was pretty much just a space for oil companies and extractive industry to run rampant and have meetings with the government. And I think it's even worse now than it was then, or maybe it's just become clearer that it's worse now because we have more information into it. But since that point, I guess I remember, I don't think I've ever been so depressed in my life as I was in that space. And I'm so glad I had the crew around me that I did, all the other great Canadian youth who I'm still in touch with and genuinely believed that if we spoke our truths and what we had seen in our communities, because there were other people of color on that delegation as well, if we just spoke our hearts and said, this is what's happening in my community. Particularly for me, I went with the notion that I needed to talk about the North, because I've spent some time in Dene territory up in northern Saskatchewan. They taught me how to fish. They gave me like clothes because I was woefully unprepared. That's my cat going crazy in the background. And yeah, I saw firsthand like the devastation that extractive industry and the introduction of that into schools, even the entire science units in like northern communities. In a community like La Loche, they have binders. Actually, I liberated one for my collection because I needed a reminder that this is in fact what is being taught in too many Indigenous students, too many students all over Canada and all over the world. That this was just like a grade 12 science book, but it was sponsored by like I can't remember exactly. It was one of the companies that was directly responsible for mining in the northern community, and it was like science by their book, all entirely designed to get Indigenous kids, Native kids into mining and into the complicity with extractive programs and processes. Since I was a student at STM, I have had lots of conversations, particularly with Chris and everyone around, finding. I've talked about this before. I found a community at St. Thomas More that I didn't necessarily find at the main campus because of the willingness, despite the fraught history and continuity of Catholic and Indigenous relations. I found willingness, at least in the spirituality and recognition that what we're fighting for is something sacred. And I remember growing up and wanting to distance myself from like hippie woo-woo, trying to appeal to rationality and logic so I was immune to anti-Indigenous racism, which never works anyway. But now I understand more that what we are fighting for is something that is sacred, to do with our spirituality, and the truth is that it makes us sick. And I think about this frequently with the weather here in Saskatoon, the 4 degrees one day, minus 40 the next day. Species are not hibernating. Everything is so out of whack. Like pussy willows are blooming now, I've heard. I know a bunch of species didn't go into hibernation. For my Anishinaabe friends in the East, their entire calendar is based on the seasons and not any kind of like set numbers. So they're doing all of their spring ceremonies already, and this impacts us in so many ways, both our traditions and our physical well-being, because we're part of the earth. And if this is what's happening to the ground and the soil and the animals, that's exactly what's happening to us. And I don't think we know the half of it. That sounds more doomy than I wanted it to, but I also don't consider it to be doomy. So I hope we can move on from that first contribution in a way that's hopeful.
Thank you, Erica, for grounding us in this place and in your own sense of context, but in our sense of place, as well as reminding us of just the sacredness of what we are trying to protect. I'm going to ask Michael Poellet to come forward. I see, there you are. Welcome to the space, Michael, and we'll turn it over to you for some opening remarks before we move into a more dialogue form. I think you're still muted.
There we go. We'll try again. Can you now hear my mellifluous tones? All right. This is my summary of Laudate Deum. Human beings are basically big babies, driven by their desires. Me, want, want, want. The job of a capitalist economy is to meet these desires without questioning them. Capitalism does not, for instance, make any moral distinction between what people want and what people actually need, between, say, PlayStations and penicillin. As far as capitalism is concerned, they all count as the same thing: choice and desire. And capitalism is designed to maximize our choices and desires through a rational triage system called the market, otherwise known as globalization. Some people win from this system, some lose. But mathematically, more people get to realize more of their choices under this system than under any other system. But the market has no view as to whether these choices are worthwhile or not, nor whether they contribute to the common good or the long-term survival of the planet. It just seeks to maximize desires. To add to this, human desire is now given greater reach than ever through scientific and technological advances. With the increasing power of technoscience, more of the world becomes subject to human will and desire, so more wants can be realized. But again, technology and science do not distinguish between wants and needs, for it too is largely subject to the moral agnosticism of the market. But as the Pope says, quote, regrettably, the climate crisis is not exactly a matter that interests the great economic powers, whose concern is with the greatest profit possible at minimal cost and in the shortest amount of time, unquote. This echoes what was stated in Laudato Si about how our praxis flows from thinking, quote, as if reality, goodness, and truth automatically flow from technological and economic power as such, unquote. And we hold as unquestionable, quote, to accept the idea of infinite or unlimited growth, which proves so attractive to economists, financiers, and experts in technology, unquote. The result, according to Laudate Deum, is that, quote, the ethical decadence of real power is disguised thanks to marketing and false information, useful tools in the hands of those with greater resources to employ them to shape public opinion, unquote. This seems to leave us in a life world of meaning categorized by futility and despair. Again, to quote from Laudate Deum, the mentality of maximum gain at minimal cost, disguised in terms of reasonableness, progress, and illusory promises, makes impossible any sincere concern for our common home and any real preoccupation about assisting the poor and the needy discarded by our society, unquote. How is this held in check? Here, Pope Francis puts his theological finger on the problem. We cannot claim to have a culture and spirituality genuinely capable of setting limits and teaching clear-minded self-restraint. In other words, who says no to the baby? Who says that what you want may not be good for you or good for others? Democracy, once thought to be a brake on the blind power of the market, has itself become a way of aggregating desire rather than challenging it. Collective selfishness, the Pope calls it in Laudato Si. Unchallenged, the market churns out piles of rubbish, meeting short-term wants rather than long-term needs. And the planet is transformed into a rubbish heap. Economists have been generally unhelpful too. We live on a limited globe with limited space and resources, but most popular capitalist free market economic models are premised on the idea of continual and unlimited growth. We borrow now to pay back later, when the pie has gotten bigger, which is the demand we constantly make of innovation and technoscience, that it will keep growing the pie. And so, like Mr. Creosote from Monty Python's The Meaning of Life, we keep on demanding more. The ecological green word for this predicament is unsustainable. The moral word is greed. The Pope links the destruction of the environment with the exploitation of the poor, and the world should pay attention. The call in Francis' encyclical and apostolic exhortation is simple. There is no alternative for us but to make do with less. It's not all about recycling and carbon credits. We need to develop a proper respect for limit. We need to value what I call the virtue of humility, recognizing that Adam, the Hebrew word for humanity, is from Adamah, the Hebrew word for dirt. Humans from humus, a sense that there is such a thing as having enough, and that in humility we recognize that there is enough for all, not just humans, but the whole life of this planet. Francis provides one oblique reference to humility in Laudate Deum. Quote, "Let us stop thinking then of human beings as autonomous, omnipotent, and limitless, and begin to think of ourselves differently, in a humbler but more fruitful way." Unquote. Francis adds to this that part of a faith-filled spirituality is finding contentment with enough. Francis' proposal for us is far from a counsel of despair. There is an enormous personal freedom to be discovered in being content with not having everything. He writes in Laudato Si, "Once we lose our humility and become enthralled with the possibility of limitless mastery over everything, we inevitably end up harming society and the environment." Unquote. Climate change is an historic opportunity, not only to heal the environment, but also to roll back the tide of injustice and ever-widening inequality that is an integral feature of our current economic system. It represents our greatest hope of solving multiple overlapping crises at the same time, of spreading wealth, resources, and political power from the few to the many, of unleashing our suppressed human values of empathy and solidarity on a global scale, and of creating political communities that reinvigorate democracy from the ground up. Rising to the climate challenge could also be the force, the grand push that brings together all the living movements for justice and liberation, catalyzing enormous levels of social mobilization across the world and bringing about a major shift in the balance of economic power. The challenge that faces humanity is momentous and daunting, requiring a dramatic decrease in fossil fuel combustion and our use of the Earth's resources, particularly in the richest countries with the highest levels of consumption. Yet, the intensification of neoliberal globalization since the 1980s has systematically sabotaged our collective response to climate change, which is a threat that came knocking just when the ideology of free trade and mass privatization was reaching its zenith. As a result, the changes needed to avoid catastrophic warming are now in conflict with the fundamental imperative at the heart of our current economic model: to grow or die. And the challenge isn't just to spend more money on the problem and change a lot of policies. It's to completely rethink our relationship to each other and the natural world, to go beyond our dominant extractivist worldview and neoliberal mindset, and to embrace a new global understanding of our common humanity and our integral relationship with nature. This would entail implementing some of the propositions proposed by what is called deep ecology. These would include the well-being and flourishing of human and non-human life on Earth have value in themselves. These values are independent of the usefulness of the non-human world for human purposes. As well, richness and diversity of life forms contribute to the realization of these values and are also values in themselves. And finally, humans have no right to reduce this richness and diversity except to satisfy vital human needs. What's remarkable about the Pope's writings on the environment, however, is the fact that as much attention is given to the shameful reality of global poverty as to the politics or science of climate change. The real import of the Pope's message is not to be found in its uncompromising policy perspectives or its scathing criticism of market fundamentalism, but rather in its urgent appeal for humanity to protect the most vulnerable, who are the majority of the planet's population and yet treated as an afterthought in international political and economic discussions. What the Pope needs to include is that the planet should be included among the most vulnerable. The Pope fervently calls upon Catholics, all people of faith and non-believers alike, to engage in a global conversation about how to create, quote unquote, a new and universal solidarity in meeting our environmental challenges, in which our ecological concerns are joined to a sincere love for our fellow human beings. This theme of interdependency, variously arguing that we need comprehensive and joined up solutions for tackling both social degradation and environmental degradation with equal urgency, cannot be overemphasized.
Thank you, Michael, again, for helping us provide a broad framework and challenging many of the assumptions of whether it's our market economy or technical paradigms. But I'm going to maybe move us now into a moment where I don't know if the other if the three speakers have any comments for each other first, but I do see that there are questions coming into the chat, which I would like to encourage, and we'll bring those forward to the speakers as well. But did the three of you have anything to say to each other before we move on, or would we like to just go into the question period?
I'll respond quickly to Michael. I wanted to say thank you so much for bringing up the element of the document that I think is really singular in positioning the struggle of the poor for justice against capitalism, because this, I think, is so often lost in discussions about environmental justice. And it's even within the Indigenous academic sphere, which I'm more familiar with, it's such a struggle to talk about the growing class differences, and I think it's a lot of things. I think it's shame. I think it's this idea that somehow we can, if we're strong enough, physically and mentally, we can overcome, right? And that is still the ideal, the Western ideal to aspire to, is having more than enough. And one of the leading tenets of what I would say is nêhiyaw philosophy or Cree philosophy, along with other Indigenous philosophies I've studied, is enoughness, and just being content with all the amazing gifts that we've been given by this earth, and all the extraordinary, the fact that there is enough for everyone. So why does everyone not have enough? And I think about this in the context of my own community. A church recently opened up its doors just 2 blocks from my house as a warming center, and it's consistently over capacity. There's so many boarded up houses in this neighborhood now because of gentrification. I feel like they're just trying to push us out day by day, probably to put up condos. And all of these things are so interconnected. In the environment, justice for the poor, justice for people who are impacted by prisons, police violence, militarism, peace activists, those who struggle with disability or healthcare or access to harm reduction, lack of access to food justice and food sovereignty, and gender justice is a huge one as well. So I think I just wanted to thank you. And one reading recommendation I would give, if you're interested in an Indigenous, and Saskatchewan, he actually taught at the University of Saskatchewan, Howard Adams. I never got to meet him, but he's been such a huge influence in my life because he wrote directly about capitalism and its intersections with colonialism and the land. And unfortunately, he's one of very few that, and Glenn Coulthard, I should say as well, who's a Dene scholar, and I'll type those names in the chat. But yeah, thank you for making those connections.
Thank you. Chris, Michael, did you want to add anything else before we move into the questions that are appearing in the chat, if you want to get a head start on contemplating those questions?
I mean, I think there's so much in what Erica and Michael said that has these resonances, right? So the disappointments of the conference of the parties' processes, while holding up the little that they've established, is a feature in Laudate Deum. In fact, there's a whole section that goes through sort of each of the key meetings since 2015, and including the Paris one, and talks about the failure the failure to have this multilateralism being effective because it's hijacked, corrupted. Our moral imaginations are limited by what I called in those opening comments segmented interests. But that's capitalism, elite interests, anything that erodes the dignity of the human person and the dignity of people on the margins in particular. And Erica just gave a great list of folks who are marginalized and how that's problematic. I like her word that she used, doobie, right? And how you can get, when you start thinking about this stuff, the scale of the problem, and Erica knows my middle boy in particular gets very worked up about the whole thing and seems like he's angry and sad and confused. It's like he hasn't, a total meltdown when he starts thinking about the interlocking crises that we've been talking about. But they really are opportunities, and there really are these moments of hope. And what's really interesting about this faith-inspired voice that's not just limited to Francis, but is present in Laudate Deum, is that there's hope that we'll get through these crises, and that, like I said, that we'll try to use them as opportunities to address these failures that have led to poverty and marginalization. So the concept that Erica is talking about, enoughness, is part of it, where people can start to have, full lives without more stuff. And he's very explicit about that and how that's possible. So extractive industries, when they're exploitive, when they view the earth as a backdrop, when they don't see the connections that Michael's talking about, that's summarized in that term, integral ecology, they're a mistake and they're a misdirection. And our human imagination, our human potential, as pilgrims, right, and working on this and journeying on this, Francis affirms that that's part of his elevation of human dignity, that we can get out of this, so that there is hope here. We just need to listen to people like Erica and Michael.
That being said, Michael, did you have anything that you'd like to add?
No, I think let's open it up for questions and give others the opportunity to speak.
Well, if we turn our mind to the questions, and if we kind of make the chat, if you look into the chat, we begin with a pretty challenging one in terms of could we possibly attain the goals that we've been talking about this afternoon by replacing polluting fossil fuels with nuclear power as a stepping stone to the future of fusion energy? So this, I think, is getting to the really concrete. How do we transition into a different way of being? Well, we've been talking about how we as collectively have to develop virtues to enable change. Is anyone prepared to speak of this concrete question of, well, what alternatives should we or could we embrace?
Yes, I'd be prepared to speak on that question for at least 6 or 7 hours. Full disclosure, as part of the Interchurch Uranium Committee Educational Cooperative, we're not in favor of nuclear power at all, and uranium mining and all that goes with it. And I'm sure Erica can add a lot to that too, about the whole environmental racism and colonial practices that go on with all the uranium mines in the north, and how it's turning many of the territories and lands of the people up there into sacrifice zones, and is devastating to that way of life. So we won't go there. With regard to nuclear power, there are many ways of looking at it in terms of why it's problematic. One of which is simply radioactivity and nuclear waste, and we don't know what to do with it. But as well, nuclear is the most expensive way there is of boiling water. And basically what we do for nuclear generation is heat water into steam to turn turbines. And, we've done that traditionally with fossil fuels, and some are proposing nuclear power. The most expensive way of doing it per kilowatt hour. The least expensive ways of doing it now are renewable energies, wind and solar. And that, for example, here in Saskatchewan, it's now being proposed and thinking about building a 300 megawatt small modular nuclear reactor. There's not even a prototype built yet, but estimated costs of that would be $3.5 billion. And we know that usually with nuclear, building of nuclear facilities, it's always the double the cost. But anyway, 3.5 billion for a 300 megawatt electrical generation over against what you could do with 3.5 billion if you would put that into solar and wind power is unbelievable. And again, the costs are much less. But I'll stop before the rant goes further.
I had full confidence that you would be ready to speak to that question, Michael. Thank you. Any other comments, though, in terms of the thinking through the practicalities of transitioning from the model we currently are engaged in?
So my kids are engaged in a battle behind me, but one of the things that's that Francis talks about in this document is the trades that marginalized communities are offered. So that's things like, he talks particularly about specifically holding nuclear waste. And I know Erica can amplify this, but that you think, oh, I'll take this, it'll give us economic development, but it's not this long-term sustainable development. And this is more in Laudate Deum, but Francis is emphatic that you have to realize that whenever we use energy, it comes at a cost. And so that there's this value in going into simple living, what Erica called enoughness, but doing that in a chosen way, right? Like chosen simplicity, not one that marginalizes people. And you can't expect people that are poor to be heroes when they're faced with these choices. You have to make sure that the structure is in place. And that's why he continually goes back to this idea of multilateralism. So the structure incentivizes positive, possible choices. I think that's the best of Catholic culture on governance, but that's a whole other topic. So I know Erica has lots to say about that.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I just think, for one, yeah, definitely I grew up and still see the impacts of the uranium mining industry in my communities, in our communities up north particularly. Native kids are like siphoned directly into uranium mining and told that's what they're gonna do because that's what their parents did. That's the only option they have. And in a lot of ways, I just see that as like despicable. And I remember one of my aunties growing up and hearing stories about like her work. She worked in a mine and she was like very highly qualified, an Indigenous woman, got lots of schooling, did everything right, still ended up in the mines, had to take like these showers every time she left work, and still ended up getting cancer. So I see no, when people are made sacrificial and when like Indigenous people and Black people and already marginalized people, or you see the stuff going on right now in the Congo with mining, are made sacrificial, we're not doing the best we can for everybody, right? And it's pretty much as simple as that to me.
Thank you. I noticed that we're getting almost to the end of our time, and I know that there are three other questions, though reading those questions, I kind of see a bit of a theme running through them. So I'm going to take a stab at kind of compiling them into one and see if we can use this as an opportunity as well to maybe end off on kind of that note of where can we go from here? Because I think each of the three questions phrased differently But really, the underlying theme that I see is about how do we encourage change? How do we encourage our governments, our circles to embrace change, to kind of convince people that enoughness and embracing enoughness is not regression, as we've been taught, right? That actually that this would be the progressive choice would be to embrace a simpler life, but that we're battling other presumptions here. So I think each of the three questions here are looking at the how. The how do we convince others to embrace change? How do we convince our communities to embrace change? If we could maybe end off with some thoughts on that, and I'm sure there'll be other opportunities to continue these dialogues beyond this moment today. But I'll leave it to the three of you to help us imagine how we can embrace and encourage others to embrace change at this time.
So, well, I can say what Francis says, and then the real prophets can speak. So Francis is very emphatic that this is something that's related to our ethical calling and purpose. When I said that he calls out Catholics on this point, he thinks that this is where faith should go, that we need to support this integral ecology in all of our actions. And then he talks particularly here, and he signals back to it, but also in Laudato Si, about the failure of courage amongst our religious leaders when they submit to colonial, capitalist, other segmented interests, and let those dictate the way that they behave as leaders. And then he appeals to that idea, and particularly on that level of the big structural change, about so this is why he's elevating the importance of multilateralism, but the legacy. So he talks about the legacy that politicians are supposed to be so concerned with and of themselves, and he says that the future generations will judge those political leaders for failing to take up the opportunities that are presented. He was originally talking about ecological crisis, mainly in Laudato Si, but here he says also with COVID-19, we had this opportunity. He says our leaders failed us, and it was narrow, it was short-sighted, and they were conforming to these segmented interests, and it was a mistake. So he appeals to that idea of legacy. He appeals to what we ought to be doing, and he raises that specter that we should know better. We should know better as individuals. Every little bit can help, but he says this is a special responsibility. He talks about this idea of common and differentiated responsibilities. It's the special responsibilities of those who are responsible for the structures, the leaders, to make sure the structures incentivize making the right. He even uses the idea of that the structures right now are sinful, that changing those structures to allow people to flourish is really important.
Do you want to go next? It doesn't matter to me.
Go ahead, Erica.
2 quick points. The first is, I think what many years of organizing has taught me is that now more than ever, we need to realize that we can't wait for everyone to get it. And that's like unfortunate. And it doesn't mean bulldozing over people. But it also, it does mean that if you look at the world in an intellectually honest way and and love it and view it as sacred and or not, and you just like understand the importance of the earth we live in, which is some type of sacredness, whether or not you know it. I think it's Asada Shakur who said nobody in the history of the world has ever gotten their freedom by appealing to the people who oppress them. So I think we do appeal to our leaders. It takes all kinds of efforts, absolutely. But for a lot of us, I think our strength also lies, figure out where your strength lies, what it where are you most needed, and what are you strongest at? And I wanted to end with a quick poem for my segment. This kills me. It's Graham Faust, Tough Crowd. Hey, all you writers and artists out there. I know you think you're lonely and tortured, but please hear me out. On your most tortured and most lonely days, think of our dear friends, the climatologists, who, when we play the bad at science game, during which we with inside fake accents beseech them, pray tell us, our children, are they the last people? Gently press their crumpled foreheads to ours, like kissing almost, and say, you don't have to stay here, but you can't go home. And of course we adore you and your plaintive surprise, but we also know that a yes or no answer is what you want so that you can give up.
Yeah. Three things very briefly. First, how do we embrace change? Change happens to us. It might be more appropriate to say change embraces us. And given that we're in that embrace now, how will we respond? Secondly, in terms of changing our thinking, and maybe this is one of the few positive things that came out of the COVID pandemic, is that people have begun to realize that there's a distinction between a standard of living and a quality of life. And our concerns here about the environment and the vulnerable and the marginalized and the oppressed is to say we need to be concerned with the quality of life, not merely standards of living. And the third thing is, and this is a much more significant change in our thinking, that basically Western theology and philosophy has always made a distinction between persons, namely human beings, and things. Persons have intrinsic value, things have extrinsic value or instrumental value, simply for our use and for our exploitation. And so our thinking changes if we begin to think that other things, non-human life and the air, the water, the soil, as well have intrinsic value, not just simply extrinsic value. And if that's the case, we'll think about things differently. One place where that's happened is in New Zealand, where they have declared that they must think of their major river system as a person. In other words, it's the kind of thing to ask again, and again, they're in environmental philosophy and ethics, those questions arise. The thing is, does air, water, soil, trees, polar bears, do they have rights? And if so, what are those rights? And how are we, as other beings who have various rights, to respond to that? And I think that, that's a big question, but it's the one that's worth thinking about in terms of understanding how we might go about responding to the ecological crisis.
Well, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you all for being here, first and foremost. Thanks to our three presenters who have shared with us their wisdom. I know we didn't get to all of the questions, and there were some really meaty ones about the connections between the environmental crisis that we're facing and the structures of colonialism. And they're very good questions, very meaty questions. I'm hoping that we can find ways to continue discussing these topics together. Just know that we have recorded this event this afternoon. We will post it on the Schmeiser Center website. I expect that we could also gather the resources that are in the chat and maybe post those somewhere if people wanted to follow up on the resources that were offered this afternoon. Thanks as well to the students who participated today and to the President's Office here at St. Thomas More College for sponsoring today's webinar. And I wish you all the very best as we continue to live on this sacred planet, care for each other and the home that we share. And again, thank you for your willingness to spend some time with us today. Have a good afternoon.